were regretting the rise of the boy emperor. The legions who had raised him up and were on hand to witness Elagabalus' day-to-day conduct were shocked at the boy's behavior. Raised with all the privileges that came with being a member of the imperial family, Elagabalus, not unlike Caracalla and Geta, had been spoiled rotten. He had no boundaries, no sense of prudence, and displayed no evidence whatsoever of holding any inhibitions. He dressed as he liked, wore the perfumes that he liked, and frequently consorted with any man, woman, boy, or girl that struck his fancy. It didn't take long for many in the legions, officers and soldiers alike, to begin to doubt the character of this proto-Commodus they had helped to win the throne. In a telling sign of the kind of loyalty Elagabalus commanded once people really got to know him, 2 eastern legions, including the 3rd, which, as you'll recall, had been the first ones to support him, both attempted revolt before Elagabalus even made it to Rome. The mutinies were put down, and in the process, the 3rd legion, the one that had been first to declare for him, was completely disbanded, which is not exactly a promising omen. Elagabalus and his extended family finally arrived in Rome in the autumn of 219, and right off the bat, Julia Maesa, through Elagabalus, ensured that the Severan dynasty was firmly re-entrenched in the hearts and minds of the Romans by forcing the Senate to deify both Caracalla and her sister Julia Domna. She then finally got her own taste of real authority by graciously accepting the title Augusta, which the Senate had generously foisted upon her and Elagabalus' mother. But that was not enough for the new Augusta, and she crossed way over the line, pretty far over the line even for the line-crossing happy court of Elagabalus, by forcing the Senate to allow her and her daughter to sit in on senatorial sessions. Women had never been allowed to take part in these proceedings, and though Livia and Agrippina had both been allowed to listen in, they were both safely hidden from view by a curtain. But Julia Maesa was aiming to become the most powerful woman the empire had ever known. She considered Elagabalus to be merely a puppet, and planned to control every aspect of the imperial. Another taboo, so be it. But young Elagabalus had no intention of being merely a puppet. He was emperor, not his mother or his grandmother. What he said was the final word, and what he wanted would be what the empire got. He was a typically headstrong 14-year-old, and much to Julia Maesa's dismay, she found herself, along with everyone else, subject to his whims. The thing that perhaps tipped the scales away from Julia Maesa and made Elagabalus so hard to control was that in addition to being the spoiled son of wealth and power, he had also inherited the high priesthood of the sun god Elagabal, which filled the teenager with the sense that he was a quasi-divine figure. We need look no further than the fact that he assumed the name Elagabalus to prove how much the young emperor felt that his role as high priest defined him. At the end of the day, it was probably more important to him than his role as the head of some mortal empire, a fact that would become all too apparent to the citizens of said mortal empire. Rome, as you know, was a highly superstitious society, and one that took its various cults and temples and ceremonies very seriously. The gods they worshipped had been the gods who transformed Rome from a disreputable little village of vagabonds into the master of the Western world. That was not a thing to be taken lightly, and it was important that credit was always given where credit was due. But in Elagabalus' mind, there was only one god, the sun god Elagabal, who also became known as Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. The new emperor, obsessively pious as he was, announced shortly after arriving in Rome that henceforth all temples in the city would be rededicated to Elagabal, because all the gods, Jupiter included, were simply inferior aspects of the one true god. The rituals and cults that had defined Rome, and in the Roman mind kept them safe, were suppressed. In their place, Elagabalus instituted dozens of variations of sun worship, with the capper being an hours-long ceremony the emperor himself performed almost daily, and that he required the Senate not just to attend, but to take part in. To the Romans, this was not just blasphemy, it was dangerous. Everyone feared what Jupiter's reaction would be when he discovered that the Romans had ceased to make offerings in his names, and that the rituals he prescribed had been abandoned. Compounding the sense of outrage that was bubbling up in Rome was the private life of young Elagabalus. Well, maybe private life isn't the right term, as it was, in every sense, a very public life. Were he alive today, it is likely Elagabalus's identity would be classified as some variation of transgender. He took both male and female lovers, but most of the time dressed in clothing that would have been considered highly effeminate. Famously, his most stable long-term relationship was with his chariot driver Hierocles, and it tickled the emperor to no end to refer to himself as Hierocles' wife or Hierocles' queen. And this was really where his conduct became a source of shame for the population. As we've noted previously, homosexual relations in Rome were widespread and not particularly controversial. But that was as long as you were the dominant partner. To have the emperor take on the passive role, dress as a woman, and cheerfully answer to the title of queen, well, that was way outside the bounds. Even when he assumed the regular old gender role of straight husband, he infuriated Roman sensibilities. Over the course of his brief reign, less than 4 years total, he took no less than 5 different wives, abandoning them and sometimes returning to them with alarming speed. Most offensive, though, was his decision to marry a Vestal virgin, so that together they could produce divine children. Obviously, this made a mockery of the virgin part of the Vestal virgins, and, if it went unpunished, the Romans feared this sacrilege would bring who knows what terrible fortune upon the empire. All of these outrages, his flouting of sexual taboos, his destruction of traditional Roman religion, and his habit of appointing low-born friends and lovers to key administrative posts, began to wear so thin that the fabric started to tear. Julia Maesa, who had been the driving force behind the boy's elevation in the first place, quietly began to reconsider her position. She found herself on the outs with the boy, unable to control the puppet she thought she had so skillfully carved. Her daughter seemed content to let the boy follow his whims wherever they may take him, happy to trade power and influence for the luxuries of imperial court life. And so, Julia Maesa began making plans to abandon them both. Giving up on Elagabalus, she turned to her other grandson, Alexander Severus, to see what he was made of. In contrast to Elagabalus, Alexander was a quiet, serious boy who seemed much better suited temperamentally for a long-term stay on the throne. Elagabalus, on the other hand, utterly indifferent to how many people he was pissing off, was clearly going to run into a dagger one of these days. If Julia played her cards right, she might be able to position Alexander as the successor to Elagabalus, and so, when Elagabalus finally ran into that dagger, she would still have another shot at being the real power behind the throne. In 221, she managed, after a bit of coaxing and pleading, to convince Elagabalus to name his cousin Caesar, and, at least for now, make Alexander the heir to the throne. This way, if anything, God forbid, should happen to you, then the throne will remain in the family. Naturally, when you have children of your own, this can all be rearranged, but for now, it's just a smart insurance policy. Think of your mother. They'll probably kill her if the throne falls into the wrong hands. As soon as Elagabalus agreed and Alexander was made Caesar, the assassination attempts began. There was no shortage of conspirators ready to take a shot at Elagabalus, and the shots started coming fast and furious as 221 rolled over to 222. Elagabalus managed to escape the first few tries, but it was becoming obvious that not only did he have enemies, but those enemies filled the ranks of the Praetorian Guard. Having the best seat in the house to witness all of Elagabalus' depravities, and being forced to obey all of his orders to boot, the Praetorians probably hated him more than anyone else, and Elagabalus soon realized that he really couldn't trust them anymore. Especially because they all seemed to love his cousin Alexander so much. And come to think of it, maybe my grandmother didn't want me to name him Caesar so he could be my heir, just in case. Maybe she wanted me to name him Caesar so he could be my replacement. Furious at being duped into appointing his own replacement, Elagabalus immediately wrote Alexander out of his will, and revoked the title of Caesar in March of 222. Suspicious of everyone at this point, he then let it be known that Alexander had actually died, just to see how people would react. The Praetorians flew into a frenzy. Not yet convinced that Alexander was dead, they threatened to riot if Elagabalus did not produce the boy alive and well right this instant. Elagabalus took note of the rage exploding out of the Praetorian camp, and was pleased that he had flushed out their true feelings. But he was not so pleased to discover that he had sort of let the genie out of the bottle. The Praetorians refused his orders to stand down, and they continued to threaten the emperor with deadly force if he didn't produce Alexander, right this instant. Afraid of what they might actually do to him, Elagabalus had no choice but to comply. Accompanied by his mother, Elagabalus escorted Alexander to the camp, and when they all made their entrance, the Praetorians began to cheer. Completely ignoring the emperor and his mother, the Praetorians raised Alexander on their shields and bore him to the head of the line and acclaimed him Caesar. Elagabalus interrupted this celebration by reminding the Praetorians that Alexander was not, nor would he ever again be Caesar, and that as the emperor, his word was final. This was a big mistake. The Praetorians turned on him with hate in their eyes, and Elagabalus suddenly realized how much danger he was in. He and his mother tried to flee, but they were quickly seized by the angry guard. Without ceremony or hesitation, they were both killed and their bodies dragged through the streets in disgrace. Elagabalus was only 18 years old, and he had ruled Rome for just shy of 4 years. His reign had been a strange detour that in the end had very little impact on the course of Roman history. All his religious reforms were cancelled immediately, all of his friends and consorts were thrown out of power, and life more or less returned to normal. As usual when it comes to the bad emperors, it is difficult to pick through the various histories to determine which stories about Elagabalus are true and which ones are false. Everyone had an axe to grind with the mad little teenager from Syria, and the only tool anyone had left was character assassination. So did he really smother dinner guests to death under a massive pile of flower petals? Probably not. But the infuriating obsession with Sol Invictus was real enough, as was probably a lot of his scandalous social life. But again, how much, and which particulars are true, is tough to discern. He was bad enough and dangerous enough that he was betrayed by his grandmother and abandoned by the Praetorian Guard, but then again, I can think of perfectly selfish reasons for everyone to have acted just the way they did without Elagabalus needing to be a horrible monster for them to do it. Julia Maesa was angry the boy wouldn't listen to her. The troops, maybe, had been promised more money